Hello and welcome to Hop Along Studio. So in today's video, I wanted to share with you 5 different ways that you can break up your art journal pages. These are background techniques that I'll be sharing today and some ideas on how you can get rid of that white blank page. I know for so many of us, including myself, sometimes I look at the journal page, it's white, it's big, it feels like, where do I even start? And especially if you're new to art journaling, it can be the hardest thing is to actually get started. So we'll be covering a few things today. I'll show you some of the projects I've used to be able to move from just a simple background to a finished piece. So let's get started. So the first technique I want to show you is how you can use ink blending just to add color to your art journaling page. In this case, I am using some Distress ink, Faded Jeans, Broken China, and Salty Ocean. And so with these ones, what's nice about them is they do go on in these nice light layers. And it's a very easy way to add color to your page. And by being able to add layers like this, you can add some very soft layers and then continue to add more layers until you kind of get the effect that you want. I actually did do another video where I went into quite a bit of detail about how to add ink blending onto a variety of surfaces. So the card for that video is up in the right hand corner. So I'm just going to add some more Faded Jeans. And the thing about this is you definitely want to move in a circular motion. You don't want to press too hard. You just want to add a little bit of color to the surface. It's a great way of just making sure that you're not stuck with that blank page where you're having to work off of it. And I'll just finish up with a little bit of Salty Ocean. And again, you can go much darker with colors like this. I just particularly chose some lighter ones because I'm also going to use this page to show you the next technique, which is adding ink through a stencil. So when you want to add ink through a stencil, you basically need to choose your stencil. What's nice about choosing a stencil is that you can choose to do the whole thing, a particular area. You definitely don't have to choose the whole background to be covered with the stencil. What's nice about it too is all these areas that are being masked will actually leave the color in behind. So if you don't want to cover up all the color, but you would still like to add some additional color to your page, this is a great way of adding a little bit of interest. So this case I'm going in with Mermaid Lagoon. I'm just going to add some in. And then one area here, I'm going to actually overlap with what we've already put down in our ink blending just to show you kind of how it looks. I will also show it to you straight on the white paper as well, or the off-white paper as this journal is, just to show you the different effects you can get. So you pull that up, you can see where it can actually be an additional layer on top of that first ink layer, but also it can be very stark against that white background depending on what kind of look that you're looking for. The other option with this is you don't necessarily have to use just ink pads. The other option is using ink sprays. So I have several different ones here. I have a Distress Oxide spray, and I'm also going to use a little bit of a mini mister spray that I created. So this was using re-inker, some mica, and just putting it in a little mini mister that you can actually make your own ink sprays that way. And to just use the ink sprays, you just basically spritz it to add your color, and I'll use the mini mister one down in this corner. So as you can see, the ink blending versus the sprays has a very different feel to it. The sprays themselves have a more strong, very vibrant look to it, while the ink blending, you can get a little bit more of a softer feel to it. And again, if you have a wet stencil like this, the other option is you can always go for the negative print by just adding it onto your next page. This is something I do a lot of. I don't often just wash everything. I will, if I have extra paint, I put it on another page. If I have a wet stencil like this, I often just flip it over and then see what kind of image I get. And so there you go. You can actually see that you get a really fun negative image to what you have here. So here's an example where I use both inking just on the surface and inking through a stencil to add textured layers in behind my main imagery. Again, a lot of it's very subtle. In this case, I actually use the same color, both just for the regular inking as well as the inking through a stencil, and that by building those layers you get those really subtle effects of fun color that you just add in to create texture to your art journaling pages. So for this next technique, I'm going to be using Bombay Red India inks to do ink drips down my art journal page. I really like these India inks for their vibrancy, but you can really use any re-inker. And so what I'm going to do is just add a little bit of ink to the top of my page. And it's better to do this in small groups instead of going too crazy doing it all at once. And just add a drop. It doesn't have to be all perfectly across. I'm choosing to be a little less random about this. And then you just basically tip your book and you'll notice that the ink will start running down. And then you'll notice with a couple of these, they're not necessarily going down quite as quickly as I would like. This is where you have some options. You can go for a very strong line of ink. The other option is you spritz a little bit of water and you spritz it on the way down. And so instead of creating really strong ink lines, you get a really soft feel. And what's great about this is then you can start adding a lot more interest to your lines. And you can see even as I let these sit, as long as they're still a little bit wet, you can get them to run a bit more and create a really soft background. I think the key is to try to not end up with ink on all the other pages at the bottom of your book. Try to use a paper towel like this just to prevent a lot of bleed onto all your other pages. And so I'm going to actually go in with another color. I'm going to add this Bombay Blue. And I've done pages where I've used both. I've gone crazy with the really strong ink lines. I've also done ones where I have just completely let the spray take over. And sometimes it's nice to let them do both. Like this one's kind of running, and I'll let it run until it decides it wants to stop, and then I will add something. And then that's where you can start adding a lot of variety to your ink marks. And then even just by adding water, it can pull the direction of the ink across your page. Let's add in a little bit of red. And you'll notice that sometimes they actually will go where the water is. So just as I put those down, they seeped into the other colors. They will go in the direction where there is wet. So something to be aware of when you're doing this, it's not going to be lifeless. It's going to take on a life of its own. But this is where, depending on how much water you add and how much of the background you want to cover up, you can end up with some really interesting final results. Just try to let that weep down as much as I can, just so that you end up with something that's not going to bleed all over your other pages. So I'll set that aside to dry. And before we move on, I wanted to show you two different examples where I use this technique. I did do a lot of negative painting, so you don't see it nearly as strongly, but I actually have all those very strong ink drips all in behind the white. And so that was really where I started with this page, was to add all those really strong ink drips. It was kind of taking over the page, so that's why I toned it down a little bit. But this one I did not really add water. I just let the ink drip down the page and kind of allowed it to have those really strong lines. Here's another example. This is a little hard to see. It's a fairly large page. But this one is a project that I've actually already done on this channel, and I have included the card in the corner just so you can see if you're interested in seeing this video and how I did it. I do have step-by-step instructions on how to do so. So you can see with this one, I did add the drips, but I also add the water, which gives it that soft feel to it. And these ones I didn't tone down at all. Basically, I just added my writing over top. So you can see by having a slightly more toned down feel to it, and by allowing the drips to kind of do their thing, you can end up with a very interesting, random feel to your art journaling backgrounds. The next technique I would like to show you is how to use ink stains. And so this page here, I actually did use ink stains on it. And if you're interested in doing this particular project, I also have included the card in the right-hand corner there. But basically, to add distress stains to your project, you want to start with just, again, any sort of distress stain that you have. I really like these Tim Holtz distress stains. They do add some really nice color and a lot of vibrancy very, very quickly onto your page. In this case, I'm going in a completely different direction than I did with this page. I went very, very bright. In this case, I have been playing around with the idea of ocean scenes, and not the bright tropical oceans, but the nice kind of gray ocean that you get along some of the shorelines. And this is not necessarily meant to be anything particular. It's just meant to add a little bit of color and a base to this page. And you can see that these go on really, really quickly. You don't have to try very hard to get the color out of them. The other option is maybe you don't want to necessarily do lines like this. You could actually do shapes if you wanted to instead. There's no reason that you have to stick with one background color. You could end up doing an entire background of shapes like this that end up being something that you add other colors on top of. It's really up to you, but where you want to go with this. And then these distress stains come in these very light colors. But you can see that if you have a deeper color underneath, it does shine through. So this is another way you can add layers without too much difficulty onto your projects. I really like that blueprint sketch color. And I'm adding, if you squeeze the bottle harder, you'll get more of the stain out of it. I'm probably pressing a bit too hard, probably adding a bit too much color on this, but in this case I did want something that I could kind of run with later on with some really strong color. But it does mix with that light blue that I had put down before, which is a really nice way of just adding colors to each other that it will complement and just add a little bit more vibrance or interest to your page. I think I'll leave that there. It's kind of soft, it kind of has a painterly feel. You could add a lot of doodling or journaling or other things on top. This could be just the very first layer. You could add stencils and other things on top. It's a really great way of just adding a really quick base with really vibrant color that you can kind of work off of and see where it goes from there. So the next example is going to be using stamping on a journal. And in this case, I thought I would maybe mix things up and use my black journal. Stamping is a great way of adding texture to your page, and especially if you don't necessarily want to cover everything up or you're not too sure where you want to take it, it's a great way of just adding some texture and some pattern just early on. And so I'm using these Distress Oxide inks for this. They should be able to have enough contrast to the black background. That's always the key with using a black journal, is trying to find images and inks that will stand up against the really dark background. So there you go. You end up getting some really great color with this. And again, you don't have to necessarily go perfectly straight. Kind of thought I would start with just having a couple perfectly straight bits in here. And do the same thing on the other side, since this is working quite well. I'm working in a journal, and sometimes I have to press a little bit harder just because the page that was before this page might actually have a lot of other stamping and inking on it and might not be completely level to stamp off of. So something to think about. And if you're interested in learning more about stamping and how to use stamping in your work, check out the card above. I actually completed a video that was specifically about stamping. And the reason for that is I wanted to give you a lot of the tips and tricks that I have that'll help you have really consistent stamping in your projects. So in this case, I'm also going to go in with a few other things. I'm going to add some letters, some numbers, and in this case, I'm going to add them all to the same stamp pad, which is not usually what I do, but it's kind of fun just to try to add some texture and some contrast. And I'm going to use this speckled egg ink. It's a fairly light ink, so we'll see how this works. Not all of these are going to be perfectly consistent or work in the way that I think they will, so a lot of this is just experimentation, just to figure out what colors work the best with your black journals. And actually that worked really well. And I'm going to pull up a couple of these stamp pads and go in with a slightly different color. I'm going to add in some faded jeans. See where else I can overlap that. And this is where you can have a lot of fun with color and shape and figure out kind of how you want this layout to look. You can overlap some of the Baroque. I think I'm going to have some Baroque overlap the letters as well. So again, your creativity is really your limit for what you can do with this. There's so many ways you can use these types of letters and stamps on your projects. This particular set of stamps is called Faded Type and works really quite well for these types of backgrounds, because again, you can add so many other things on top. You don't have to stick with just this. You can add other textures, other colors, other designs. You could add some ink blending. You could add some ink drips on top of this. Again, there's no end to the fun things that you can do with this. The other option is you do that second stamp or third stamp. Like I showed on my stamping video, I actually go through quite a few techniques that I like using for this type of design. So you go back in with another Baroque stamp. We're going to move to a slightly different color. So fossilized amber is next. And again, by using all those different values, instead of it taking over and looking like a stamping mistake, and even you can choose not to be completely cover the stamp. You can cover some areas in ink, so then that also gives you that more soft look when you are stamping your images. So as you can see that just by adding a few stamps and a few different colors, you can end up with a very interesting start to your mixed media background. So I wanted to show you what you can do when you combine a few of these techniques together. So this one has the ink blending through the stencils here. I've also used the stamping in layers to add kind of a mid-ground on this page. I've also added a few stamps along the top in that kind of blue ink with the Baroque stamp set, just to add a little bit more interest. And I finished up adding the green ink, which was ink blended along the bottom. So even though what I've been showing you today are a lot of those places of where to start on your art journaling layout, it can also be added in different layers on your project. I also wanted to show you what the result was of our ink blending. Now that this is dry, you can kind of see how the colors softened a bit, melded together due to the water that I added, and it adds a really nice place to start adding other layers and textures onto your background. So don't ever be too worried about just adding ink and seeing where it could go, because you can come back to it another day looking at it as an opportunity and as a starting place to start your next layout. So those are the 5 ways that I use inks to break up the white background on my art journaling pages. And I hope that you've enjoyed a few of them, and maybe it's given you some ideas of where to go next. And then from there, really, you can add anything onto your art journaling pages. There's a variety of mediums and textures and all sorts of things you can add. You can add paper, you can add stamped images. The possibilities are really endless. I have a lot of art journaling projects on my website and on this YouTube channel that can also help you as you're trying to figure out, well, what to add next. I have lots of examples and a lot of step-by-step tutorials on how I approach it after I've completed that initial background. Also, if you're not too sure what to do with your journal, and sometimes those blank pages can feel intimidating, often if I have a day where I'm not really feeling a lot of creativity, but I want to do something with my art supplies, that's where I will often take my journal and just start prepping a few pages. Throw on some inks, throw on some stencils. Don't complete anything. The whole idea is to get some color down, to get rid of that blank page so that the next day or the next week when I'm starting to feel really motivated and I have an idea, instead of having to start with a background, that first layer of that background's done. From there you can move on and add your other images and your other colors, and it can often speed up the process. So I'm a strong believer in pre-prepping your pages and just getting some color down and seeing what that will inspire for you in the next step. So I hope you've enjoyed this video and maybe learned something new. If you have, if you could like it and subscribe to my channel, I really appreciate your support and your interest in what I'm teaching here. Also, I have my website where I have pictures and step-by-step instructions for each of my video tutorials. It's one way that I like to be able to give you something you can reference back to, and maybe you're not as much into watching long videos over and over again and you just want the Coles Notes version. It's all there on my website. So I hope you have a really great week, that you take some time for self-care, and I would love to see a comment below on what you've liked about this video. Have a great week, and I will see you next time.